Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Lisa Lubin as she shares about her trip around the world.
Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean Go Solo Live? Have you ever been asked, why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Joining me today is Lisa Lubin. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You bet. And just so people can follow along with some of this, if they're interested, and we'll mention this at the end and it will be in the show notes, you can find Lisa at LL World Tour, and her tagline is Slow Travel, Eat Local. Where in the world are you right now, Lisa?
Right now, today, I'm in my kitchen in Chicago.
And so I am a big fan of Chicago. It's actually I live in Milwaukee, so even though there's often a rivalry, that's not a problem. I actually take women solo travelers to Chicago on an experimental weekend so they get a feeling for more urban travel and they get to practice using public transportation and things like that.
Cool.
And I'm curious, since a lot of people actually start traveling solo by doing some things in their own backyard, what are some of the recommendations you might have locally?
Oh my gosh. Well, I love Chicago, so I'm a huge ambassador to the city. Wherever I go, I've had people from all over the world come visit. And I've lived here 20 years. Gosh, I mean, it's funny because living here is part of the reason I was like, why can't I travel alone? Because I hang out in my city alone. I go to lunch alone. I walk around, it's not like I have someone always on my arm escorting me everywhere I go when I'm home. So it was that was sort of part of my, would help me know I could travel alone out of Chicago. But I think, quick thing, I think the weather's nice. Obviously the lakefront is beautiful. I mean, you have your own lakefront, the same lakefront up there in Milwaukee. But I think renting a bike, I'm a big bicycle proponent, and it's flat here, which is very nice. And there's more and more bike lanes every year. So it's very safe to ride. There's lots of bike paths, like the lakefront path. So it's a really neat way to get around the city and see people around the city. And there's bike tours as well, and which I learned also when I traveled alone. I like to do some things like that, like a bike tour, because then I make new friends on my tour.
Okay, we're going to keep going down this path for just a moment. So I love that. A couple of things that I would always say is a way to get the lay of the land in a new city is a walking tour or a bike tour. And I'm a big fan. My previous partner in life was on the Chicago Bike Federation. So all those good kudos you just gave for bicycling in the city of Chicago is awesome.
Huh.
One of our favorite things to do, so I will ask you, was about doing Bike the Drive.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So Bike the Drive is this amazing event that happens the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend where they shut down Lakeshore Drive and they open it up to just bikes. The last time I did it, I think there were somewhere around 10,000 participants. Have you done it?
I have. Yeah, I've done it like 2 or 3 times. Definitely in the beginning. I think I may have been on the first one. I'd have to look that up of when that was, but really great. I mean, because it's a beautiful view. That's one of our, it's a highway basically on the east side of the city, between the city and the water basically. And so like she said, closing it all down to cars. So it's just bicycles and it's just a beautiful view, just like you own the city. It's a really neat event.
I think that's fantastic. And I will say that I was a newbie bicyclist when this started. I mean, I'd ridden a bike before, but certainly not for distance, and even got tricked into doing the full 30-mile loop. And it was worth it. It was so fantastic.
It's fun. Really cool.
Very cool. Well, let's get out of our fandom of Chicago and let's get into your adventures. So you have LL World Tour set up for a reason. Why don't you give us a little bit of a background and we can get further into your travel story.
Sure. Well, the blog itself, llworldtour.com, I started way back in 2006 when there were at least fewer blogs than there are now. Really, I was working in television. I was a TV producer at ABC in Chicago and had the travel bug. And, we can get into that more if you like, but I basically quit my job and decided to travel around the world. Was not my plan all my life. It just sort of organically happened. But once it happened, it happened. And I was so excited to do this thing because I love traveling. I had traveled solo on like one other trip before and I didn't love it, but I was going to do it. And now I love it. So obviously I've become an expert at it and learned all the beautiful things about it. But I quit my job. I sold my car and my condo, packed up everything and sold a lot of stuff. And I left to travel around the world October 2006 and started my blog at the same time that summer.
What made you not love it in the beginning or before you did this big trip and you decided that you were going to?
Sure. I think the first time I really traveled solo, I was with a friend. We went to Europe for 3 weeks together and decided that, he wanted to see some things, some places I had already been, and I wanted to see Prague and some new places I hadn't been. So we decided to do the first half together and then part ways and go, our separate routes and directions. So, just I think like you would expect, like when we first said goodbye, it was just so lonely. It was just such a contrast. When you're with someone, you have someone there to share everything with and help you and whatever. And then I remember the first couple days, I hated it. I was just so in my own head. It was so quiet and weird and lonely, basically, but then I started to, get used to it. And, after a few days, I sort of hit my stride and, it was the first trip. So I still wasn't putting myself in certain situations that I do now to meet people.
Sure.
But I just started to kind of, grow into it and get used to it. And honestly, still to this day, I always tell people, like, give yourself transition time. Because even when I was traveling solo and I'd make friends though. So I was rarely solo. And then I'd get to the next destination and it was like a blank slate. And I was always sort of down the first day. And it was like the same thing as that first trip I took, because I just needed transition time to like let myself feel a little weird and a little lonely, or, oh, I like the last place better, and the last hostel was nicer. And then in a couple days, nope, actually this one's nicer. And you just sort of like magically get used to things.
That's a really good point, because what you're sort of saying is this idea of, is there solo travel regret, or is there that sense of almost grieving? And I think that comes up for some people while they're traveling solo, when they feel like they don't have anybody to share things with, which to me leads to, isn't that part of the reason why the blog was started?
Yeah, actually. I mean, especially for me, and like I'm sure a lot of people you've interviewed, it started as a way just to keep in touch back home with friends and family before it kind of became a business. And that's exactly what it was. I was already a journalist and a writer and a producer, so it was sort of natural for me to want to write stories, but I wanted to do it only when I wanted. I didn't want it to be a job. I just wanted to share, because I was just thinking that my mom is on the other end reading this, or my friends, and which was probably some of my better writing, because I was just free flowing, excited. And, but yeah, so I started to keep in touch with people, and the internet is a whole other tool and obviously way to not feel lonely, by meeting people online and then meeting them in real life through various websites and meetups and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think, we're only at the beginning of the possibilities of some of that. I'm in some solo travel women Facebook groups, and recently somebody was saying, oh, I'm going to be in New Zealand next January and I'm going to do this, this, and this. I'm like, well, I'm going to be there too for a couple of weeks. And who knows? I mean, again, it's a big country. It's not like saying you're going to be in Atlanta. You're going to be in the whole country of New Zealand for 2 weeks. But the ability to say it's possible that we might be able to make a connection.
Yeah.
It is there is some comfort in familiarity, and it's always fun to hear how other people like to travel to a place that you've gone before, and how, how they like to travel there versus how you like to travel there.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think that those two things aren't like mutually exclusive. Like solo travel doesn't mean it doesn't equal being miserable or not having familiarity or putting yourself in situations to meet people, whether they're expats or other travelers or locals, whatever makes you comfortable. That's the beauty of it. And that's why I love solo travel, because that's my number one thing. You see my tagline is get low, what is it? What is it? Slow travel, eat local. So, like getting local, meeting locals, but really just meeting people is what travel is all about. And I meet way more people when I'm solo than when I'm with someone. And I think we all know that.
It is. That's I think that's actually the biggest myth, is that when you're traveling solo, you're going to be really lonely. I think you are only going to be as lonely as you choose to be. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you're choosing. But if you want to step out and put yourself out there to anything, there's so many options available to you.
Yeah. And especially with the internet, it is such a great tool for that on my early travels, I didn't have. And, that also reminded me exactly what you just said. When I was on that first trip I told you about, and I was on my own, and it was the first few days, I was actually in Austria, and I was lonely, and I was like, it was nighttime, and I was like, oh, I feel like everyone's out. I'm just sitting here. So I was like, all right, I forced myself to go out to a bar, and you know what? It was awful. Like, it wasn't good. I didn't meet anyone. So it also depends on like the situation, but now I know the situations to put myself in, or joining a cooking class or a bike ride or a tour of some kind, or volunteering or dance class, all these different ways, or, a couch surfing meetup, all these, there's so many ways to meet people that are way more comfortable for me than sitting in a weird bar where everyone is sort of with their friends, and and they're speaking, German, or, it's very hard to. So I remember sitting there and just finally like having a beer and then just leaving, because I wasn't going to just start randomly talking to people. And I didn't feel comfortable because I'm actually an introvert. So it just wasn't for me. And then I learned tools that work for me and totally meet tons of people. And I love it.
I agree. And I think that there's something to be said for doing what works for you. So you found a variety of activities, and I love using meetups. I have gone, when I've been in foreign countries, there's often people there who still want to try practicing speaking English. And so in foreign countries, I've actually found meetups that focus on practicing their English, and they love having an American come to that.
Yeah.
So that's been fun. The other part is, I don't so much mind a hotel bar, because there you are more likely to be surrounded by other people like you in some way, shape, or form, rather than going to the locals on that. So we, of course, have some time today to get into, what you did on the world tour. But one of the things that comes up in a lot of these interviews is, so I quit my job and went to travel around the world, or so I quit my job in this. And people hear that and they're like, I could never do that. Or how did this person do that? And I like to try to make that statement relatable. How did you go about the process of leaving employment and then creating an income for yourself, doing what you're doing and things like that, so that it made this whole thing possible?
It's interesting. I mean, everyone's lives are different. Everyone's finances are different. For me, let's see, a lot of factors. I had a really good job in broadcast television for about 10 years. And even though 10 years prior, I didn't know I was going to do this, I was already a saver. So I was already just good with my money. I was saving money. I'm not a consumer-y person. And I wasn't then, and I'm not now. And I'm, as I'm sure you and many people, I preach, experiences over stuff. And I already was like that. I wasn't into like fashion or a car, or, I had one used car my whole life. I sold it when I left to travel. So I already was frugal, and from upbringing, from whatever. And I don't have children, so I wasn't spending money, obviously, on that. So I just didn't spend a lot. So I did save a lot of money and was lucky that I had parents and I could learn by example that they were always saving money. So it was just sort of what I did. So I was lucky to sort of have a good, decent savings. And also, I had a condo at the time that I sold. So
Sure.
right before I left I was very lucky. It was 2006, so the
Mm-hmm.
market was really good still. And I doubled my money on this condo. Now it wasn't like a amazing huge condo, so
Sure.
it wasn't like tons of. But what I did though is I actually just took the money I made and I invested that money as like a security blanket. So I knew I had my own savings, and now I have this extra savings, so I can go travel and travel cheaply. I mentioned staying in hostels. I did couch surfing. I also traveled as if I had very little because I didn't want to just spend all my savings. I wanted to try and see what I could do. I ended up sort of breaking even in some places because I was working. So as long as I was breaking even, it just meant I could keep extending my trip. So I saved money. I sold a condo, so that helped me a lot.
Sure.
And then, like I said, even on the road, I was very budgety and just trying to travel. I didn't want to dip into my savings, so I was just traveling really low. And as of course, as many people know, and I tell many people, almost everywhere I went was cheaper than here. So if I stayed in
Right.
Chicago for those 2 years, I would have spent way more money. Yeah, I probably would have had a job, so that of course is different, but I would have spent more money here on just the cost of living than I would have in almost everywhere I was, including London, because I did couch surfing in London, which is free. So even though it's a place that's super expensive, you find ways to combat that. So it wasn't expensive for me because I wasn't paying rent or lodging.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. And so I've heard the story before of as long as I had budget, I could keep extending my trip. And therefore, if I want to keep traveling, I need to travel frugally so that I can keep going to all these other places.
Right.
Logic
And
makes sense.
slower and slower. That's
Good point.
another huge tip is travel slowly, slow travel. So the slower I traveled, which also was great for meeting people, for immersing, getting into a society, like really the cheaper it is because the most expensive things is the transportation or the flights from point to point. And the less flights I took throughout the year, the cheaper it was. So I would just stay in each place longer, instead of then buying two flights, I only bought one, in that same time frame. So that's also a huge money saver. So all these tips and ways to do it. I always tell people it's cheaper than you think. Now, sure, if you don't figure it out and you're like, oh, I got to stay at this fancy hotel, then it's not cheaper. But there's ways and tips and tricks to make it all happen.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Now, not saying like there's fear of missing out, but let's think about knowing what you know now and the places that you've been. Hindsight always gives some different perspective. What would you have done differently when getting ready to embark on this?
Hmm. Uh, you know, the only thing I can think of has to do with my blog. Like, I don't think I would do much differently with the travels themselves. They're pretty awesome. And, I could sure think of a million different ways I could have gone but I just think of actually my blog. If I'd known then what I know now, like I would have chosen a different name and I would have
Hmm.
thought of it as more of a business and that kind of thing. But I still
Okay.
don't think I would have because at the time I didn't want it to be a business. I was trying to take a year off, not work.
I love that. And I think that that holds a lot of meaning too, is that sometimes doing it for the sake of just doing it, you're not working, you're having fun. Your intention was to stay in touch with people, not necessarily trying to build a business and a brand.
No, exactly. Yeah. It wasn't at
Perfect.
all.
Well, let's take us through now some of the actual travel parts of it. And again, you've been around the world. So where would you like to start?
As far as where did I go?
Yep.
So yeah, I actually tried to sort of follow the warm weather in the beginning. So even though I was gone a year, you're always going to encounter different weather. But I left in October, so I just said, well, I'm going to go to the southern hemisphere first. So I went basically my first place, and another tip is that I went to Costa Rica and I enrolled myself in a Spanish immersion program for 2 weeks right away. So that my first thing, I was busy and I was doing something because I didn't want to just be wandering. I wanted to have something to keep my mind occupied, knowing it might be, obviously I'm transitioning to this crazy year off. So I knew it was going to feel daunting and weird. So I lived with a family and I did a Spanish immersion. And the cool thing about this school is that it was Spanish lessons in the morning and surfing lessons in the afternoon.
That sounds fantastic.
So that was really cool. So that was just fun, a way to keep me kind of just doing something. And I actually tried to do that throughout my travels, to change it up in each location to like, okay, here I'm going to volunteer, or here I'm going to try to work, or here I'm going to do this immersion. So I was trying, and I did a 2-week bike tour in Vietnam. So always trying to do different things. So I wasn't just sort of walking around the world for a year, as a tourist. I wanted to change it up. I like variety. So I was in Costa Rica for about a month, and then I went down to Ecuador and I did one of my splurges, which was the Galapagos islands, which are amazing. I was just telling a friend the other day, she's going there, and it's one of my favorite like natural places. It was just fantastic. The animals, the different islands, everything's different on each one. And then I continued on to Chile, and I went all the way down to Patagonia. And a friend actually met me there. So a couple times during my trip, a friend would meet me somewhere, which is pretty cool. And although on the solo theme, I will say, and I was just telling someone else this, that as much as it was fun to see my friends, once I got into the groove of how much I love traveling solo because I met so many people, I actually did have thoughts like, oh, my friend's coming to this place. Oh, that's great. On the other hand, I wonder who I'm not going to meet because they're coming.
Right.
I actually thought that it was going to be a different experience, and I wouldn't be as local as I like to be because I'd be distracted with this person. And so, pluses and minuses on each side.
There always are.
Yeah. And then basically, I don't want to take up the whole show with my geography.
That's okay.
Went to Patagonia. We went all the way down to like Puerto Montt to Punta Arenas. We took this boat through the fjords, which was pretty cool. It was like this sort of, not a cruise ship. It was like a working kind of boat. And then I went up to Buenos Aires, which was fantastic. And then I flew around to New Zealand and Australia. And one thing I also will say is all of that was one sort of open jaw ticket that I got before I left from STA Travel, which I actually think still exists. They're like a student travel agency.
Okay.
It was fantastic. It was a great price. And these were all these legs of this one sort of ticket. I think actually the one ticket was through Central and South America. And then I think it was a separate ticket to Australia. But once I got to Australia, I had no more tickets. That's what I tried to do also, was just sort of, okay, it's way too hard to plan out a year. I only planned out Costa Rica really as far as like what I was doing. And then I did buy those other tickets, but you have to kind of guess dates. How are you going to feel, But I thought once I get to Australia, like, God, 2 months later, I'll regroup. Here's a place I can regroup.
Well, and it's big enough that it could take you forever to see Australia. So why not?
And it's like, I know the language. It's just a place. Right. It was in my head. It was like a milestone of a place I can relax a little, let my guard down. It's going to be like America. And it was, which actually meant for me, it was kind of boring. But that's another story. And I stopped there to figure out, okay, I'm going to go to Southeast Asia now. Where am I going to go? Tickets, and just started looking into my next leg of my trip. And in the meantime, I actually got a job in Melbourne at a coffee shop. So I ended up working for 3 months in Melbourne, Australia, in Fitzroy, which is like a big cafe area, making coffee and sandwiches. And I had no experience in that. And it was really nerve-wracking to get that job. I had no work visa. I was, temporary, and had no cappuccino experience. And
okay.
and they have a huge coffee culture there. So
yes.
I did actually get a job. So again, that was awesome because it just meant the job paid for I did stay in a hotel there. It paid for that. So then I was just sort of living for free basically. And I could just enjoy and, I wasn't really spending money. I was just sort of on a holding pattern, which is kind of cool. Um, and yeah, and that was like the first part of my trip.
That sounds amazing. And again, you took that time to regroup to, like you said, Australia maybe wasn't that exciting, but it did give you you were able to have some comfort while you were making your next plans.
Right. Yeah. And just had I could go. Actually, another interesting thing is before I left, I needed, shots and some vaccines. And one, I think it's the hepatitis. You need like 3 rounds, and one of the hepatitis ones.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one I need, it had to be 6 months later.
Yep.
Well, it just happened to be also that 6 months later, I was going to be in Australia. So I was like, perfect. I'll find a clinic. That'll be great. And it was like cheap, great healthcare. So it was kind of cool also knowing it's a place I can get stuff done. I can buy stuff I need. Not that you can't buy stuff everywhere, but it just, for me, not knowing, it gave me comfort. And I was able to take care of things, get this job, meet locals. And then I did, move on to Vietnam, where I did this 2-week bike trip basically from Hanoi to Saigon, which was incredible. And that was with a group. And again, I met people. It was a way, I knew nothing about Vietnam. So it was a great way for me to say, okay, that's a place I'm just going to do a group tour. Was with Intrepid Travel. And it's great because you then have a family for 2 weeks. So you really get to know these people. And it was really, really these great experiences where I'm still friends with a lot of those people.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So let's dig into your biggest lessons learned whether you want to say through the whole trip or if you want to say up to this point, but biggest lessons learned.
The biggest thing is sort of in line with what I've been saying, or one of the biggest things is that I learned that I learned so much just about confidence. And I felt like I was dropping into these, you land somewhere super foreign and you figure it out. And I love that part of it. Actually, you get the money, you figure out how to get to where you're going. I loved that part. It just gave me such confidence. But I think the biggest thing I always sort of gravitate toward is to say that I learned I could build a community wherever I go. If I'm moving somewhere, I know I'll build a community. I know how to now. I know how to meet people. I built communities in when I was in Australia. I also, after Southeast Asia, I went to Turkey for 3 months and I lived in Istanbul, and I ended up, and I never knew I was going to do these things, but I ended up teaching English there for 3 months got word of mouth clients, and ended up living there for free in an apartment because I was cat sitting for a woman I had never met before, through another person who told me about her, that, a guy that owned an English school couldn't hire me, but he asked me if he could help me with anything else. And I said, I don't know. I love animals. I need a place to stay. Do you think anyone needs a pet sitter for the summer? And he said, yes, I do. And he called this woman, and 2 weeks later I was at her place and she was showing me around. And then I lived in her apartment in central Istanbul for 2.5 months, in exchange of watching her 2 cats, Oscar and Wild. She was from Ireland. And it was fantastic. And I met people there and I built a community. I guess the greatest example of that, and I loved it there. And people were so friendly, so helpful, and also very, like most other countries, like everywhere now, I guess, but so cell phone centric. And I did not have a cell phone at this time. I did not travel with a smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2007, so it was whatever. But this guy's like, oh, I have an extra phone. I'll give you my phone. I'll get a SIM card for you. And so then I had a phone, and then within a week, my phone had 20 numbers in it of all these people I had never known before that were now my new friends, and through the school or through random people, just the most random word of mouth stuff. And I realized, wow, I'm building this community of my new friends here in my new town of Istanbul. And it was just so incredible.
That is amazing. I love it.
Mhm.
What kind of what's changed about how you travel now? Because when the trip that we're talking about, this was the first big adventure. Now you are, well established. Your blog is now being used for a different purpose. What is travel like for you now?
Gosh, it's very different now because fast forward a few years and I'm, back. I did actually live out of a bag for 4 years. Um, Traveled around the world that first time. Then I kind of came back to the States, but I didn't come back to like a home, and I traveled around and then I left again and then came back. And then in that time, I started freelance writing and photography. And like I said, I'm a journalist and I already was a writer. Um, and I had this blog, and now I started writing for magazines and newspapers and some online publications. So I started pitching and doing that. So between then and now, one of my many jobs is as a freelance travel and food writer. So I write for the Chicago Tribune, I write for American Airlines, United, different magazines, um, and so now my travels are different in that I'm mostly really working. And a lot of times I'm hosted. So I'm going on press trips. In other words, I'm not paying my way.
Hmm.
So,
Correct.
and my schedule's not always my own. So it's like, it's work. It's like, it's wonderful. It's great, but it's a whole other animal. It's like a different, so I rarely am just like going like I was then in complete freedom and just awe of everything. It definitely has changed. And I definitely slowed down because I was traveling so much. Even though I was traveling slowly, I also learned that I had no desire to be like a full-time nomad, and I know a lot of people do that, and people do in between, and I was doing in between. And then I knew eventually I wanted a home base again. Like we mentioned, I love Chicago. I was excited to come back here. So it wasn't like I was running away from a horrible place. So I like my home base. So now, yeah, I'm based here, but I'm still traveling quite a bit, but usually for articles that I'm writing and assignments like that.
It sounds like you're very busy. How much are you traveling?
Um, it keeps varying, and every year I keep telling people I'm gonna travel less. I'm gonna try to travel less, which sounds so weird for someone that loves travel, but I really wanted to slow down even more. I would say like once a month, I guess now. When I first kind of came back, I was still like I would leave for a month and come back. Like I had my place,
Okay.
but I would Airbnb it, and then I would be free. Like I went and spent a month in Colombia because I hadn't been there on my round the world. So I left the States again and spent there, or I went to Portugal for a month. So I loved doing that. Now I'm definitely going on shorter trips. Um, and the truth of the honest answer of that is because I have a cat. And so I don't like leaving him for a month. And I don't have family here. So it's a little complicated as far as getting a sitter. I need a person like I was in Istanbul to come live in my place while I
Right.
travel. And I'm actually thinking about that and putting feelers out for that. And of course, there's house sitter, pet sitter websites that I'm on for that.
Yeah, no, I think there would probably be a good interest of people coming to Chicago
Yeah.
and wanting to do that, especially, depending on where you are in the city, I think. So if any listeners have an interest, that might be something to reach out for.
Have to
I've
be a
had
cat lover.
exactly. And actually I'd be like, I'd come down for a weekend, but I have two cats myself, and I will
See.
say that has been a bit of a changer for me in the amount of travel that I've.
Right. It is. It is. I was fostering when I first came back from traveling, which was awesome. I was just being a volunteer, and I would foster when I was home. They could live with me, and then they would get adopted, and then I would go about my travels. So it was like a no commitment. And then
Yes.
finally, I became what some people say I was a foster failure because I ended up adopting one, which is really a foster winner, I think. But yeah, and that's kind of what happened. So, but yeah, like I was just in Mexico for an assignment. I was in San Miguel de Allende. Actually, that article, I haven't seen it yet, but it came out today in Luxury Las Vegas magazine. So I'm excited about that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You have so much going on. Let's make sure that people know where to find you, how to follow you.
Sure. So my blog is llworldtour.com, and I'm pretty much LL World Tour across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. My other whole job is I'm a video consultant. So as a former TV producer, I help teach and coach people how to do video and also do some video production still. And that is my sort of umbrella company, which is LL Media. So it's llmedia.co.
Perfect.
And one other thing I will say, since we were talking about travel tips and solo tips, in the beginning I actually forgot, but I have a book on Amazon, which has a lot of, I think it has a whole chapter on traveling solo, and it's called The Ultimate Travel Tips, Essential Advice for Your Adventures. And you can get the Kindle version on Amazon. It's got tons of great tips.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I truly appreciate you spending time with us today, and I look forward to following you on your future travels.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Lisa shared with us today? She continues to echo the sentiment that when you travel solo, you meet more people than if you were traveling with others. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about planning your solo travels. If you like these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show. There's lots of options with some great gifts of appreciation. Just go to www.patreon.com/GoSoloLive. That's patreon.com. We've reached the end of another episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Find us on Twitter at Go Solo Live and reach out, share your thoughts. And certainly share this episode with a friend you think might be interested. Until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.